July 15, 1979, Oakwood, Texas. For 45 years, a killer walked free. In the summer of 1979, when disco ruled the airwaves and America was still reeling from the energy crisis, a small Texas town became the epicenter of a nightmare that would haunt its residents for nearly half a century. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning would end with a crime so brutal, so senseless, that it would shatter the very foundation of a community that prided itself on knowing everyone's name. The victim was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She had dreams, aspirations, and a future that stretched endlessly before her like the vast Texas horizon. But on that fateful day, in July 1979, all of that would be stolen in an act of violence that defied comprehension. For decades, investigators chased shadows. They followed leads that led nowhere, questioned suspects who weren't guilty, and watched as evidence grew cold while families grew older, their hope dimming with each passing year. The case file gathered dust. The killer's name remained unknown. Justice seemed like a distant memory. But in 2024, everything changed. Advanced DNA technology, the kind that existed only in science fiction back in 1979, finally gave investigators the breakthrough they desperately needed. A name emerged from the genetic database, a face materialized from the shadows of the past. And suddenly, a community that had learned to live with unanswered questions found itself confronting the shocking truth about who had been living among them all these years. The arrest sent shockwaves through the town. Neighbors couldn't believe it. Family members were stunned. How could someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone they had seen at the grocery store, at church, at community events, be capable of such evil? This is the story of a crime that time couldn't erase, a family that never gave up hope, and a community that discovered that sometimes the monster hiding in plain sight is the last person you'd ever suspect. It's a story about how modern science finally caught up with old evil, how persistence triumphed over time, and how justice, though delayed, was not denied. Welcome to Oakwood, Texas, population 3,200, a place where everyone knows everyone, where doors are left unlocked, and where the most exciting thing that usually happens is the annual county fair. But in July 1979, this sleepy town would become the setting for one of the most baffling murder cases in Texas history. The year 1979 was a time of transition in America. The country was dealing with long gas lines, high inflation, and the Iran hostage crisis. But in small-town Texas, life moved at a different pace. People still gathered at the local diner for coffee and gossip. Children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. And violent crime was something that happened in big cities, not in places like Oakwood. That sense of security, that belief in the inherent goodness of their neighbors, would be shattered on July 15, 1979. The temperature that day reached a scorching 98 degrees. The kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and forces people to seek shelter in air-conditioned buildings. It was the kind of day when most folks stayed indoors, which makes what happened next even more chilling. Because on that sweltering Tuesday afternoon, evil came calling in Oakwood in Texas. And it would take 45 years, advances in genetic science, and the determination of investigators who refused to let a cold case stay cold to finally bring the truth to light. This is that story. A story that begins with a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her and ends with an arrest that no one saw coming. A story that proves that sometimes justice doesn't have an expiration date. Oakwood, Texas in 1979 was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower than the rest of the world. Nestled in the heart of East Texas, surrounded by pine forests and rolling hills, this small town of just over 3,000 residents embodied everything Americans romanticized about small-town life. Main Street was lined with family-owned businesses that had been passed down through generations. The local bank president knew every customer by name, and on Friday nights, the entire town gathered at the high school football stadium to cheer on the Oakwood Eagles. The summer of 1979 had been particularly brutal. Week after week of temperatures soaring above 90 degrees, with humidity that made the air feel thick enough to cut with a knife. The drought had turned the usually green lawns brown and brittle. Even the mighty oak trees that gave the town its name seemed to wilt under the relentless Texas sun. Air conditioning was still a luxury many families couldn't afford, so windows stayed open at night, screen doors remained unlocked, and neighbors looked out for each other in ways that seem almost quaint by today's standards. It was against this backdrop of trust and community that 23-year-old Sarah Michelle Thompson lived her life. Born and raised in Oakwood, Sarah was the youngest of 3 children in a family that had deep roots in East Texas soil. Her father, Robert Thompson, owned Thompson's hardware store on Main Street, a business his own father had started in 1943. Her mother, Linda, taught 3rd grade at Oakwood Elementary School, where she had been beloved by students and parents alike for over 15 years. Sarah had graduated from Oakwood High School in 1974, where she had been homecoming queen, captain of the debate team, and valedictorian of her class. She possessed the kind of natural beauty that turned heads wherever she went, with long auburn hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. But it wasn't just her looks that made Sarah special. She had a way of making everyone feel important, whether she was helping elderly customers at her father's store or volunteering at the local church. After high school, Sarah had attended Sam Houston State University, where she studied elementary education, following in her mother's footsteps. She graduated summa cum laude in 1978 and returned to Oakwood with dreams of teaching at the same school where her mother had inspired countless children. The school board had already offered her a position starting in the fall of 1979, teaching 2nd grade. Sarah lived in a small apartment above Miller's Bakery on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from her childhood home. The apartment was modest but charming, with hardwood floors, high ceilings, and windows that overlooked the town square. She had decorated it with antiques from her grandmother's house and plants that she tended with the same care she planned to give her future students. In July 1979, Sarah was working part-time at her father's hardware store while preparing for the upcoming school year. She spent her mornings helping customers find everything from nails to paint, and her afternoons developing lesson plans and decorating her future classroom. Evenings were often spent with friends at the local diner or attending community events at the Methodist Church, where the Thompson family had been members for 3 generations. The town itself was experiencing a period of quiet prosperity. The lumber mill on the outskirts of town provided steady employment for many residents. Small businesses along Main Street were thriving. The recent completion of a new highway bypass had brought more travelers through town, boosting revenue for local restaurants and gas stations. Crime was virtually non-existent. The most serious offense the Oakwood Police Department typically dealt with was the occasional drunk and disorderly charge, or teenage prank. Police Chief William "Bill" Morrison had been protecting and serving Oakwood for nearly 20 years. A former Marine who had served 2 tours in Vietnam, Chief Morrison ran a tight but fair department consisting of himself, 2 full-time officers, and 1 part-time deputy. The jail had 4 cells, but it was rare for more than one to be occupied at any given time, usually by someone sleeping off too much beer rather than any serious criminal. The social fabric of Oakwood was woven tight with traditions that stretched back generations. The annual Founders' Day celebration in May brought families together for a parade, barbecue, and dance that lasted well into the night. The Christmas pageant at the Methodist Church was a community-wide production that required months of preparation. High school graduation was attended by nearly everyone in town, regardless of whether they had children in the graduating class. This was a place where people left their car keys in the ignition and their front doors unlocked, where children played outside until dark without their parents worrying about their safety, where the biggest scandal might be someone getting divorced or the preacher's son getting caught smoking behind the church. Sarah Thompson embodied everything good about Oakwood. She was kind without being naive, intelligent without being condescending, and beautiful without being vain. She had turned down marriage proposals from two different young men, not because she didn't want love, but because she wanted to establish her teaching career first. She dreamed of making a difference in children's lives, of inspiring them the way her mother had inspired her. On July 14, 1979, Sarah spent the evening at her parents' house, helping her mother prepare materials for a church fundraiser. They talked about her upcoming teaching position, her plans for the classroom, and her excitement about shaping young minds. She left around 9 o'clock, walking the familiar 3 blocks to her apartment under a canopy of stars that seemed especially bright that night. Nobody could have imagined that within 18 hours, Sarah Michelle Thompson would become the victim of a crime so shocking that it would haunt Oakwood and Texas for the next 45 years. July 15, 1979, began like any other sweltering summer day in Oakwood, Texas. The sun rose at 6:47 a.m., already promising another scorcher that would push temperatures well into the triple digits. Sarah Thompson's alarm clock buzzed at 7 o'clock sharp, just as it had every weekday morning for the past month. She had developed a routine during her summer break from preparing for her teaching career, starting each day with coffee and toast before heading to her father's hardware store. But Sarah never made it to work that morning. At 8:15 a.m., Robert Thompson called his daughter's apartment when she failed to show up for her scheduled shift. The phone rang and rang with no answer. This was completely unlike Sarah, who prided herself on punctuality and had never missed a day of work without calling ahead. Concerned but not yet alarmed, Robert assumed she might have overslept or perhaps felt under the weather from the oppressive heat. By 9:30 a.m., when Sarah still hadn't appeared or called, Robert's concern deepened into genuine worry. He asked his wife Linda to drive by their daughter's apartment while he minded the store. Linda found Sarah's car parked in its usual spot behind Miller's Bakery, which only intensified her anxiety. Sarah's car was a 1976 yellow Volkswagen Beetle that she had bought with money saved from working summers at the hardware store. It was her pride and joy, and she drove it everywhere. Linda climbed the narrow wooden stairs that led to Sarah's second-floor apartment. The door was closed, but unlocked, which wasn't unusual in Oakwood, where many residents rarely bothered with locks during daylight hours. Linda knocked gently and called out her daughter's name. When no response came, she slowly pushed open the door. The sight that greeted Linda Thompson would haunt her for the rest of her life. The apartment had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out, and their contents scattered across the hardwood floor. Books from Sarah's extensive collection lay strewn about like fallen leaves. The small television had been knocked over, its screen cracked. Picture frames were broken, their glass scattered in dangerous shards that caught the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. But it was what Linda found in the bedroom that transformed concern into horror. Sarah lay motionless on her bed, her body positioned in a way that immediately told Linda something terrible had happened. Her daughter's auburn hair, usually so carefully styled, was matted and disheveled. The floral sundress Sarah had worn the previous evening was torn and stained. The room showed clear signs of a violent struggle, with the bedside lamp broken and the contents of Sarah's jewelry box scattered across the floor. Linda's screams brought neighbors running from blocks away. Within minutes, the small apartment was filled with people who had known Sarah her entire life, their faces reflecting the same shock and disbelief that would soon grip the entire community. Someone had the presence of mind to call Chief Morrison, who arrived within 5 minutes of receiving the call. Chief Morrison immediately secured the scene and called for backup from the county sheriff's department. This was far beyond anything the Oakwood Police Department had ever handled. The chief had seen violence during his military service in Vietnam, but finding it in his peaceful hometown, inflicted upon someone he had watched grow up, shook him to his core. The initial examination revealed that Sarah had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The medical examiner, Dr. James Patterson from the county seat, estimated that death had occurred sometime between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. The apartment showed signs that the perpetrator had spent considerable time there, methodically searching through Sarah's belongings. Jewelry was missing, including a gold necklace that had been her grandmother's and a class ring from Sam Houston State University. The crime scene told a story of escalating violence. It appeared that the intruder had initially entered through the unlocked front door, possibly believing the apartment was empty. When Sarah surprised him, the situation had spiraled into something far more sinister than a simple burglary. The evidence suggested that Sarah had fought desperately for her life, with defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had tried to protect herself from her attacker. What made the crime even more chilling was its apparent randomness. Sarah had no known enemies. She wasn't involved in any romantic relationships that had gone sour. She didn't owe money or have any connections to criminal activity. She was simply a young woman preparing to start her teaching career, living quietly in a town where violent crime was virtually unknown. The brutality of the attack shocked investigators who had expected to find evidence of a burglary gone wrong. Instead, they discovered a crime scene that suggested something far more sinister. The level of violence used against Sarah seemed personal, yet there was no obvious connection between the victim and any potential perpetrator. News of Sarah's murder spread through Oakwood like wildfire. By noon, crowds had gathered outside Miller's Bakery, their faces etched with disbelief and fear. Parents who had never worried about their children's safety suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about their community. The unthinkable had happened in their safe haven, and nothing would ever be the same again. The investigation into Sarah Thompson's murder began with all the urgency and determination that Chief Morrison and his small department could muster. Within hours of discovering the crime scene, investigators from the Texas Department of Public Safety arrived to assist the overwhelmed local police force. The crime scene was photographed extensively, evidence was collected, and witness interviews began immediately. The first major lead came from Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, an elderly widow who lived across the street from Miller's Bakery. She reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck parked near the building around 11 p.m. on July 14th. The truck had been there for approximately 30 minutes before driving away without headlights. Mrs. Hutchins couldn't make out the license plate or provide a detailed description of the driver, but she was certain it wasn't a vehicle she recognized from the neighborhood. This sighting led investigators to focus their initial efforts on identifying owners of dark pickup trucks in the area. In rural Texas, this proved to be a monumental task, as nearly every third household owned some variation of a pickup truck. The investigation team compiled a list of over 200 potential vehicles that matched the general description, leading to weeks of interviews with bewildered truck owners who had no connection to the crime. The second significant development came when investigators discovered that several items were missing from Sarah's apartment beyond the jewelry initially noted. A small amount of cash from her purse was gone, along with a portable radio and a camera she had received as a graduation gift. This evidence seemed to support the theory that the crime had begun as a burglary that escalated when Sarah unexpectedly returned home or woke up during the break-in. Acting on this burglary theory, investigators began examining recent parolees and known criminals in the surrounding counties. Their attention quickly focused on Marcus Williams, a 28-year-old drifter with a history of breaking and entering charges. Williams had been released from the state prison just 6 weeks before Sarah's murder and had been spotted in nearby towns asking about work opportunities. The case against Williams seemed to strengthen when investigators learned he had been staying at a motel just 15 miles from Oakwood during the week of the murder. The motel clerk remembered him because he had paid in cash and kept irregular hours. More damning was the discovery that Williams owned a dark blue Ford pickup truck that matched Mrs. Hutchins' description. For 3 weeks, Williams became the prime suspect. Police tracked his movements, interviewed his associates, and built what they believed was a solid, circumstantial case. The pressure to solve the case was immense, with media attention growing daily and the community demanding answers. Chief Morrison felt confident they had their man when Williams failed a polygraph test and couldn't provide a solid alibi for the night of the murder. However, the case against Williams began to unravel when forensic evidence failed to support the theory. Fingerprints found at the crime scene didn't match Williams. More significantly, when the State Crime Lab completed their analysis of physical evidence collected from Sarah's body, none of it pointed to Williams as the perpetrator. Blood type analysis, the most advanced forensic technique available in 1979, excluded Williams as a suspect. The investigation then shifted focus to Sarah's personal life. Despite the lack of obvious romantic entanglements or personal conflicts, investigators interviewed every man Sarah had dated, every classmate from college, and every customer who had regular contact with her at the hardware store. They examined her phone records, her mail, and her personal diary, searching for any hint of someone who might have harbored romantic obsessions or resentment. This phase of the investigation led to the questioning of David Mitchell, a former high school classmate who had asked Sarah to marry him twice and been rejected both times. Mitchell had recently returned to Oakwood after completing military service and had been seen talking to Sarah at the hardware store just days before her death. Some witnesses reported that he seemed upset when she politely declined his invitation to dinner. Mitchell became suspect number 2, and for several months, investigators pursued this angle with determination. They discovered that Mitchell had been drinking heavily since his return from the military and had been heard making bitter comments about Sarah's rejection. His military training gave him the physical capability to overpower Sarah, and his familiarity with the town meant he would know about her living situation, but once again, forensic evidence failed to support the theory. Mitchell's blood type didn't match evidence from the scene, and despite extensive questioning, investigators couldn't place him at Sarah's apartment on the night of the murder. His alibi, while not ironclad, was supported by multiple witnesses who placed him at a bar across town during the estimated time of the crime. As 1979 turned into 1980, the investigation had consumed thousands of man-hours, interviewed hundreds of potential suspects, and followed dozens of leads that led nowhere. The case file grew thick with reports, photographs, and evidence that seemed to point in every direction except toward the actual perpetrator. By the spring of 1981, the Sarah Thompson murder investigation had reached a devastating standstill. Despite the tireless efforts of local police, state investigators, and even FBI consultants who had been brought in to assist, no viable suspects remained. The case that had once consumed the entire law enforcement apparatus of East Texas was quietly relegated to the cold case files, joining thousands of other unsolved murders across the nation. Chief Morrison, who had aged visibly during the investigation, found himself haunted by his failure to bring Sarah's killer to justice. The case had become personal for him, not just because he had known Sarah since she was a child, but because it represented everything he had sworn to protect when he took his oath as a police officer. The inability to solve the case ate away at him, contributing to his decision to retire early in 1983. For the Thompson family, the transition from active investigation to cold case status felt like a second death. Robert Thompson struggled to keep his hardware store running while dealing with the constant reminder that his daughter's killer walked free. Customers would often approach him with theories, supposed sightings, or well-meaning but painful expressions of sympathy. Linda Thompson took an extended leave of absence from teaching, unable to face the classroom, knowing that somewhere out there, a murderer might be living a normal life. The impact on Oakwood itself was profound and lasting. The town that had once prided itself on unlocked doors and children playing outside until dark became a community gripped by suspicion and fear. Hardware stores throughout East Texas reported a surge in sales of deadbolts, security systems, and firearms. Parents began driving their children to school instead of letting them walk. The annual Founders' Day celebration was cancelled in 1980 and 1981 as the community struggled to find reasons to celebrate. Local businesses suffered as the media attention brought unwanted notoriety to the town. The story of Sarah's unsolved murder was featured in true crime magazines, television documentaries, and newspaper articles that invariably described Oakwood as the place where a brutal killer had never been caught. Tourism, which had been a small but steady source of income, virtually disappeared as people associated the town with violence and unsolved crime. As the years passed, new theories emerged periodically, often sparked by similar crimes in other parts of Texas or the arrest of serial killers, whose timelines might have intersected with Sarah's murder. Each new development brought a brief resurgence of hope for the Thompson family and renewed media attention for the case. Investigators would dutifully follow up on these leads, but none ever produced the breakthrough they desperately sought. The 1990s brought advances in forensic science that offered new hope for cold cases. DNA analysis, which had been in its infancy during the original investigation, became a powerful tool for solving decades-old crimes. In 1995, the Texas Department of Public Safety launched a cold case unit specifically designed to re-examine unsolved murders using modern forensic techniques. Sarah's case was among the first to be re-examined. Evidence that had been carefully preserved since 1979 was sent to advanced laboratories for DNA analysis. The results confirmed what investigators had long suspected. The killer's genetic material had been preserved in the evidence collected from the crime scene. However, without a suspect to compare it against, the DNA profile simply became another piece of evidence waiting for the right match. The case was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, when it became operational in 1998. This national database allowed investigators to compare DNA evidence from unsolved crimes against profiles from convicted criminals. For years, the system would automatically search for matches to Sarah's case, but none were found. Robert Thompson passed away in 2003, taking with him the hope that he would live to see his daughter's killer brought to justice. Linda Thompson, now in her 70s, had become the primary advocate for keeping Sarah's case in the public eye. She attended every cold case conference, spoke with every journalist who showed interest, and maintained a website dedicated to her daughter's memory and the ongoing search for answers. By 2010, 31 years after Sarah's murder, the case had been assigned to Detective Maria Santos of the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit. Santos, a veteran investigator with a reputation for solving seemingly impossible cases, brought fresh eyes and modern techniques to the decades-old evidence. In March 2024, Detective Maria Santos received a phone call that would finally crack the Sarah Thompson case wide open. The call came from the FBI's Combined DNA Index System laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. After 26 years of automated searches through the national database, they had found a match. The DNA profile from Sarah's 1979 murder matched a sample that had been entered into the system just 3 months earlier. The sample belonged to 68-year-old Thomas Eugene Hartwell, a longtime Oakwood resident who had been arrested for aggravated assault following a domestic violence incident. Texas law required DNA collection from all felony arrests, and Hartwell's sample had been processed as part of routine procedure. Detective Santos felt her pulse quicken as she reviewed Hartwell's information. He had been living in Oakwood not just recently, but continuously since 1975. In 1979, he would have been 23 years old, making him a contemporary of Sarah Thompson. More shocking still was his address. Hartwell had been living just 4 blocks from Miller's Bakery when Sarah was murdered. The investigation into Hartwell's background revealed a man who had managed to hide in plain sight for 45 years. In 1979, he had worked as a maintenance worker for the County Road Department, a job that required him to travel throughout East Texas and gave him intimate knowledge of small towns like Oakwood. He was known as a quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself and rarely socialized with co-workers or neighbors. Hartwell had married in 1982 and divorced in 1995. His ex-wife, when contacted by investigators, revealed a pattern of controlling and increasingly violent behavior that had escalated throughout their marriage. She described incidents of rage that seemed to come from nowhere, followed by periods of calm that made her question her own perceptions of his behavior. Further investigation revealed that Hartwell had been questioned briefly during the original 1979 investigation, but only as part of the routine canvassing of the neighborhood. He had provided investigators with a simple alibi, claiming he had been home alone watching television on the night of Sarah's murder. With no evidence to contradict his statement and no reason to suspect him, investigators had moved on to other leads. The breakthrough came when Detective Santos decided to re-examine every piece of evidence using modern forensic techniques. Advanced DNA analysis revealed not just one D, but multiple genetic profiles from the crime scene. The secondary profile, which had been too degraded to analyze in previous decades, now provided additional confirmation of Hartwell's presence in Sarah's apartment. Even more damning was the discovery of touch DNA on items that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Hartwell's genetic material was found on Sarah's jewelry box, confirming that he had been the one searching through her belongings. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who had entered the apartment with criminal intent and escalated to murder when confronted by his victim. On April 15, 2024, exactly 44 years and 9 months after Sarah Thompson's murder, Thomas Eugene Hartwell was arrested at his home on Maple Street in Oakwood. The arrest was carried out by a joint task force, including Detective Santos, FBI agents, and local law enforcement. Hartwell offered no resistance and showed no emotion as he was taken into custody. The arrest warrant detailed charges of capital murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The evidence against Hartwell was overwhelming. DNA matches from multiple sources, fingerprints that had been preserved but not properly analyzed in 1979, and a timeline that placed him in the perfect position to commit the crime. News of the arrest spread through Oakwood within hours, creating a shockwave that rippled through the community that had lived with this unsolved mystery for nearly half a century. The arrest of Thomas Eugene Hartwell sent shockwaves through Oakwood that were felt far beyond the town's borders. Within hours of the news breaking, media outlets from across Texas descended upon the small community that had been haunted by Sarah Thompson's unsolved murder for 45 years. Linda Thompson, now 79 years old, received the call from Detective Santos at her home, where she had maintained a shrine to her daughter's memory. The elderly woman, who had spent nearly half a century seeking justice for Sarah, broke down in tears upon hearing that her daughter's killer had finally been identified. She had never given up hope, but had begun to fear she might not live to see this day. The reaction from longtime Oakwood residents was a mixture of relief, shock, and disturbing realization. Many remembered Hartwell as the quiet man who had lived among them for decades. He had attended the same grocery store, the same gas station, and had even been present at community events where Sarah's memory was honored. The thought that they had unknowingly shared their town with a killer for so long left many residents feeling violated and questioning their own judgment. Former Police Chief Morrison, now 81 and living in a nearby retirement community, expressed both satisfaction and regret upon learning of the arrest. He had carried the weight of the unsolved case throughout his retirement, often wondering if there was something he had missed during the original investigation. The knowledge that Hartwell had been questioned and released in 1979 was particularly difficult for the former chief to accept. Local newspapers ran headlines that captured the community's astonishment. Neighbor was killer all along, and 45-year secret finally revealed. The story was picked up by national news outlets, with many focusing on how advances in DNA technology had finally brought justice to a case that had seemed hopeless. Hartwell was held without bond pending trial. His court-appointed attorney indicated that his client would likely enter a plea of not guilty, setting the stage for a trial that would force the community to relive the trauma of 1979 while finally seeking closure. The case serves as a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed by decades, can still prevail. It demonstrates how modern forensic science can reach back through time to solve crimes that once seemed impossible to crack. Most importantly, it shows that victims like Sarah Thompson are never truly forgotten, and that dedicated investigators will never stop seeking the truth. For Oakwood, Texas, the arrest of Thomas Eugene Hartwell marked not just the end of a 45-year mystery, but the beginning of a long overdue healing process for a community that had lived too long in the shadow of unsolved violence.